Well, also, I think you're right. And I think that, I don't know how you feel about this, but a lot of times you'll be somewhere and someone will do something or say something that's absolutely extraordinary, and people will just go right by it.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pleasure of the Text, a shared and management space where readers and writers make meaning together. We're your hosts, Gareth and Shannon.
Good morning, Shannon. You know, I'm always amazed that you just flawlessly do that introduction every time.
I like how you use the word flawless. Thank you, Gareth, because no one will know that on the back end there was a lot of edits to get to that point.
Take 5. So what are we doing today? We're doing something exciting.
Today we have just jumped off an awesome interview with a lovely lady, 68 years old, based in Los Angeles, DC Frost. And I'll just read a bio on DC Frost. And oh my gosh, Gareth, this was an amazing conversation and can't wait to share with everyone. But DC Frost is a second generation Angelino. For almost 20 years, she has worked as a fundraiser at a small private liberal arts college in the heart of Los Angeles. And before that, PBS and Variety. Denise has published several literary fiction short stories in journals, including UCLA's Westword. DC loves and respects Southern California, a melting pot of class and culture that is often misrepresented and misunderstood in popular fiction and media. DC lives in Eagle Rock, California, with her husband, who is an NPR journalist and reporter, and 3 rescue dogs. DC and her husband have an adult son, a filmmaker who resides in Los Angeles.
Yes, so that's DC's backstory, and the book she has just had published is called A Punishing Breed, and it's a crime novel set in Los Angeles, and obviously the setting is very important to the book. And gosh, we discussed a lot of fascinating things about writing and about place and process and so forth. Which hopefully everyone will enjoy. But before we jump into that, I'll just give everyone a quick synopsis of A Punishing Breed. Obviously, as everyone knows, I'm terrible at these, so I got this off the internet.
Give yourself
so
more credit.
You can read it yourself in your own time if you wish, but as a bit of background. A Punishing Breed, the first in a series of novels featuring Detective DJ Arias, is a murder mystery that takes place in Los Angeles, the city of angels, freeways, Santa Ana winds, and honeysuckle slithering through chain-link fences and perfuming LA's dark streets and neighborhoods. Detective Arias hunts for a murderer on a liberal arts campus that prides itself on its progressive curriculum but is rife with jealousy, racial and sexual tensions, and a hierarchy as real and destructive as a medieval fortress. Which could actually describe this podcast, Jan. DJ Arias, good at his job because he sees the worst in people, is challenged by the college community, a neighborhood recluse, and a young Latino gardener he sent to jail 10 years ago for a hit-and-run accident. Through the course of his investigation, Arias will find out that no one is who they appear to be. He begins to reclaim his humanity by adopting a dog he names Evidence and finding the clues to a crime born from a dark secret, not contained in the past, but alive in the present, which will cast destruction and murder on the denizens of the small liberal arts campus. So that's kind of that's about right, really. But I don't think it really captures the tone of Denise's writing, which is really striking, a little bit Chandlerian, and it's quite a journey, isn't it, into a whole series of sort of dark hearts and secrets and lies. So,
and the characters are complex and they wonderfully reflect upon each other as you delve through the plot and towards the end of the book. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's a bit like walking through one of those halls of mirrors. One thing we discussed during the interview is that there's a degree of film noir referencing, or at least there's a flavor of film noir transported into the present day, which I think is quite hard to pull off. And this kind of house of mirrors that is the book could almost be a scene from the lady from Shanghai with Orson Welles. And if you know this reference, then you're going to love this book. Not that it features in it, but it very much captures the same kinds of complexities and human foibles. So fascinating read and a really fascinating interview with a very insightful writer.
It was an amazing interview, and I hope everyone is on the edge of their seats. And without further ado, here we go. Well, welcome, Denise. It's so great to have you on the podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm doing well. Thank you. I'm in Los Angeles. It's a little gloomy, but okay.
Because you guys are about to head into winter right now?
We are. I know. It's opposite for you, right?
Oh, yesterday it was so humid. It was 31 degrees where I'm based at the moment in Queensland.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
Actually, I can't convert that to Fahrenheit for you. Apologies on my end.
I know.
I think it's about 120.
Is it really?
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure.
Well, it's been incredibly hot in the United States in certain areas. Like where my sister lives in Austin, Texas, it was like over 100 for, I think, maybe 12 days in a row. So
oh, wow.
120 would not surprise me. Particularly Las Vegas gets to 120 and things like that. So
yeah, I think it is quite similar weather actually in Las Vegas and Los Angeles. And so we've actually just finished reading your book, A Punishing Breed. We loved it, and we're so glad to have you on.
Thank you.
And it did mention in your bio that you have published this book in your later years. Can we mention your age?
Oh, please do.
60?
68, yes.
68, which is incredible. And we were just wondering if you could share some of your journey of becoming a novelist in your later life. What challenges or surprises did you encounter along the way?
Well, I will say that I've written my whole life. When I was a little girl, I would write TV scripts. I was a big TV watcher as a little kid. And I don't know if you're aware of a series called The Munsters many, many, many years ago. But when I was a little kid, I went to my bedroom and wrote a script for The Munsters and came out and said, here it is. So I think it's always just been something that I've done. And when I learned to play the guitar, I learned to play the guitar by writing songs. And then when I was an adult, I did do a lot of literary fiction and published about 5 or 6 stories, short stories in different journals. And then at one point, I just decided, why not try to write something that I really love, which are mysteries. I feel that mysteries, it's a genre that you can explore a lot of different ideas, and you can, I think, reveal a lot about human behavior. So I just decided, literally it took me 10 years to write this novel because I kept starting and stopping. But I also wrote it because I had a mentor who was my writing teacher who hated any kind of popular fiction. He was just like, oh, it's literary fiction. It's got to be literary fiction. And I stopped working with him and I thought, I'm just going to write what I want to write. I'm going to write something just really like that's a genre that I love. And so I started it. And during the pandemic, I finished it, or almost finished it, but I had a therapist and I said, okay, I'm stuck in this book. I'm almost done. I don't know how to finish it. And he gave me some great advice that helped me finish the book, which was basically show up every day, give yourself a time period, and just stick to it and write it. And he said, next time I see you, you better have done that. So I was like, uh-oh. Okay. So I started getting up at 5 a.m. and writing for 2 hours every day, which sometimes turned into 3 hours or more. And that's how I finished the book.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did a review of Solaris by Stanislav Lem some time back. No sense of time, but it was some time back, and we were talking about how with that book he got about halfway through it, and then went, well, I don't know where this is going, and so threw it away into a drawer, and his unconscious apparently got simmering, and suddenly it all came to him, which I think is quite interesting because a lot of writers, or writing courses, for example, will talk about things like the hero's journey and these sort of pre-existing structures, which always seemed to me to be more of an impediment than a help, because you've suddenly got this external thing to worry about. But it's interesting how when you're not working on something, it can be kind of simmering away. And to a certain extent, Lem got the book finished by taking it out of the drawer and just working on it again. Was it a surprise to you when you finished it, the ending? Did you find yourself surprised?
Yes, I was surprised. I didn't know the ending, and I don't outline. I'm working on my second book now, so it's a series. And while I was writing it, I kept thinking to myself, should I outline this? Should I? Because a genre or a mystery is pretty structured. And unlike literary fiction, and when I did literary fiction, my teacher would always say, it's going to come to you. It's like having a dream. It'll end in there'll be something at the end that will be what it should be. So I went back and forth. And then I read Stephen King's On Writing, which I love. I think it's a great book about writing. Yeah. And he talked about, he doesn't outline, but he said a lot of people do. But what he likes about not outlining is that you're like walking on a tightrope, or you're like a trapeze artist. You're just going through the air and hoping you land somewhere, and that's safe or not safe. And I really like that idea, because I think, and I love that story you just told, because I think while you're writing, you are exploring all these themes that you're not even consciously thinking about. And it wasn't really till I got into talking to some writers groups who had read the book, where they would bring up certain things, that I realized that the whole, I think, theme of the book for me is about people who have something very monumental happen in the middle of their lives, their lifespan. And it's that, and I do that Malamud quote in it where he says, there's a life you lived before, then something happens, and then it's like the reckoning, how you live with yourself afterwards. And I think we all go through that. And it could be something amazing, or it could be something really devastating. And for some people, it's having children, or some people, it's doing something they thought they were not capable of. But I think you write, and you don't understand all the themes of what you're doing until maybe you're done. So I like that idea of just kind of putting something away, and then something strikes you. And I think towards the end of a book or writing, it almost starts penetrating your dreams, because you just start thinking about, I mentioned this, and I have to actually go back and put that in, because as you're writing, you're also kind of going back and rearranging the different things that happened. But I do think that those things sort of come together in a way that make it really exciting, hopefully for the reader, but for the author too. But I think a lot of people really do like to outline, and I feel that that's also a really legitimate way, but it's just not what I do. And I do want to say, because I worked at a college for a while, that there was a playwright that came in, and he said something fascinating, which I couldn't even understand at the time. He said he liked to do a structured thing where he would limit how many words a person would say in dialogue. So maybe everybody else is having long running sentences, but this character would only have, maybe never have more than 5 words in a sentence. So he would put that restriction on himself, and he said it made him more creative. And I thought he was insane. But then in the book I'm writing now, I have a character that I made sure never said more than 5 words in a sentence. And it was really interesting. So I love those ideas of structure and outline, and then throwing them all out the window. I think that's kind of fun.
Constraints are very interesting. We've also talked about the Oulipo on this podcast, and Georges Perec. And he wrote a whole novel without including the letter E in it.
Really?
Which it's a lipogram, and in French that's even harder than it is in English.
Wow.
It made him incredibly creative. He found that the text virtually wrote itself after a while, because the constraint was sort of forcing him to constantly sort of wind his way around this thing. And then, of course, writers will then sort of abandon the constraint once they've, got what they wanted out of it, which is always interesting. Would you use any other constraints in your writing, do you imagine?
I think I would. When I first heard this playwright talk about this, I thought he was crazy. I thought, how could you even, because sometimes just the getting up and writing is just so hard. And in and of itself. But I did find it incredibly freeing because you start to concentrate definitely what the character's trying to say, but it's also a characteristic of that person. And so it's like any other characteristic. If, somebody has maybe a hand that doesn't quite work right or something else, it restrains you, but it also, I think, opens up like a whole other way to express yourself or your character. So I do think I would do that again. I don't know if I could write a whole book without the letter E. There's no the there or there, but I think that is fascinating. And this character and this playwright was a really amazing person, and teaching and saying that to students, I thought was a really interesting idea. So yeah, I think I would do that.
You've mentioned having a mentor, and because I wanted to ask, who was the first person to read your work and what feedback or reaction from them had the most impact on you as a writer? And you also said that with this mentor, he wanted you to write literary fiction. And I feel like this book would have been a completely different book 10 years ago if you'd listened to him. Did you want to go deeper into that at all?
Yeah, actually, I think he was probably very influential. And when I first started going to so I met him through a UCLA extension course on writing, and then he invited me into his private workshop. And there was probably about, at any given time, maybe 5 or 6 of us. And the first time I wrote a story, of course, I was like, oh, I got invited to this workshop. I got this manuscript back that was just written all over, and then it would have arrows in the back about all the rewrites of the sentences. And he was very, very adamant about killing your darlings. And I think that when someone notices your work, you think, oh, I'm very poetic. I can just I have all these wonderful things I write. And I think it's been a lifelong discipline, but remembering that just because you write something that you think is beautiful may have nothing to do with the scene, the character, or what's going on. And I still have to go back and strip all those things away. And it is killing your darlings. I mean, you think, oh, I've written this really poetic passage, but does it have anything to do with the story or moving the story forward? So I think that was the shocking thing when I first got my story back, how written over it was, and but all of those things that he told me were actually very helpful. He never tried to change the structure of the story or where it was going. It was more just how you write. And I think that it also taught me that you just need to put it down. You need to write it down, and you can go back and change it, over and over again or not. But if you don't put it down, you don't have anything to work with. And I think it taught me that wasn't my first initial reaction. My first initial reaction was shock and dismay.
We've all been there.
Like, what is this? This is my baby. But and I studied with him for years. So I would say that after years, at some point I got my story back and it was still written over, but what didn't look like, somebody had done something terrible to my story. His comments were always to make it better. But after a while, you start to self-edit. And I think self-editing is the best thing that can happen. Because if you don't and again, I think you just put everything down on the page and then you go back and you just cut it away. It's like sculpting, I think. And it's also puzzles. I love puzzles. And I think editing is a lot like doing crossword puzzles.
Yeah, it is. It's very deductive, like in sort of both senses.
Yeah.
Got to get black on white. I can't remember who said that. Somebody clever. But you got to get black on white before you can actually really start writing your work. I wanted to talk to you. I mean, I didn't really read your book as a genre book per se. Always been very troubled by the concept of genre and the sort of assumptions people make as soon as that comes into the frame. But you were mentioned in the New York Times, which is worth, spruiking. So A Punishing Breed was compared to Helen Eustace's Edgar Award-winning The Horizontal Man, which I can't say I was actually familiar with.
Me neither.
Yeah, there was a bit of I was like, goodness me, an exemplar of the campus murder mystery, which is interesting. I guess it's a subgenre within mystery writing. So Eustace was compared to writers like Agatha Christie or Dorothy Sayers, and I don't see that in your writing at all. I was reminded very much of Raymond Chandler.
Oh, well, you're just making me very happy.
Oh, good. I mean, Ferencia Lake, I just thought that sounds like a character that Chandler would have come up with. But certainly your writing has a lot of panache. I'm not a mystery reader particularly, so I was enjoying the writing. That was very much my entranceway in. But I was thinking about your influences. Now I noticed there was echoes of film noir, universal horror, and Pulp Fiction in the sense of Chandler, but also of comic books. So I was curious if those were the influences I was noticing, but would you be willing to talk about your influences more generally?
Yes. So I did start reading Nancy Drew books when I was very young. And then I read all of Agatha Christie when I was in high school. And I love Agatha Christie. And she also wrote under two other names. I think Christine, I'm forgetting her other names, but they were different types of books. But I also love P.D. James. I like P.D. James because I think there's real loneliness in her books. I love the fact that her characters just have this aloneness that they're never going to solve, that they will never connect truly with another person. But I do love film noir very much. And I love Raymond Chandler. And, there's another writer I absolutely love. But I think I love some of these writers who wrote about California in the 50s and the 60s and the 40s. But I think now one of the things I really wanted to do is to write about LA, how I perceive it, living here. I mean, I was born here. My parents were born here. I often see LA portrayed in ways that I just don't agree with at all. I think there are a lot of times written by people who live on the East Coast or in New York who always have this kind of like snide view of Los Angeles. And I don't really feel that. And then the second book, it still has DJ Arias in it, but it also is about people who live in the film industry, but not like the stars or anything. It's the people who actually work really hard and work 14 to 16 hours a day working in the film industry but on the peripheries, or they write about it. And it is an industry town. And what that means is that people work really hard and they dedicate their life to it. But there's only a few people who you see portrayed, like you always see the Disney kid who has a terrible life afterwards, or you see the star who's just really a moron or whatever. And I just don't see that in Los Angeles. I see a whole different world. And I also see the seasons, and you're probably familiar with that. I mean, the seasons that people talk about in the United States are the fall, the Christmas of fall, the snow and the winter. But we have our seasons too. It's just different. It's not snow, but it's cold. California can be very cold. And I think that there is just beautiful, the air feels beautiful. We have gorgeous plants everywhere. And there's a real feeling of being in LA and waking up in the morning and hearing birds sing that you don't hear, that you don't experience in New York or even San Francisco. And the way the Santa Anas feel on your skin and that sense of anticipation. I love all those things. So I think that's really important. And then I live with my husband, and my son's 27 now, but they were big comic book people. They loved comic books, and my husband still does. So I saw that culture, and I kind of experienced how that means things to people. And it's always shocking to me, but for people who love comic books, it's like their Bible in some ways. They so associate with those characters, and they're just like any other literary character. It's just in a different medium. So I felt that was important to someone who might not have other ways of expressing themselves.
Mm.
And in the character, obviously in the book, there is someone who has some physical restrictions. and doesn't see himself that way.
We normally spoil books on this podcast, and I'm trying really hard not to delve into the plot or the characters because I understand a lot of our listeners are going to go out and get your book. So if I pause for a bit, that's probably me like biting the words because I just want to talk about your book a bit more. So I'm going to go away from that. I really enjoyed the structure of the book, and you have the first few chapters where all the suspects are laid out, and it reminded me of those scenes in the movies where you've got your detectives, they've got the pictures up, you've got the strings attaching all the scenes, the evidence. Was this structure your original idea, or did that come through editing, or did you draw your inspiration from other places for that setup?
I always liked the P.D. James books where you delve into different characters, and you kind of get a sense of their life. So I think that did influence me. But then I was looking for kind of structure because I don't do outlines. There was a book I read, and I wish I could credit this person. It was a woman who talked about writing books and mysteries in 4 sections. And so each section is kind of like, one, the introduction, 2 would be sort of the meat of it, like where you're getting more into what the crime was or what the basic issue of the characters are. And then the 3rd should be delving deeper. And then the 4th should be like, you're just running towards the end. And the 4th section, I love this. She said it should be like stripped down, not long chapters. You're telling now everything that you've been withholding. You're just like letting everything come out, and you're very clear, so that if you have a reader who's stuck with you through that, then suddenly you're like, okay, I get that. And it's interesting being in a writing group, because I think you start to see people, and I would say this of myself too. You start to see like you're hiding, you're planting things in about characters. And I've seen people who don't want to like tell you at the end what's happening, and it's so frustrating. And I think that book, or that the way that she laid out that structure, was really helpful. So I try to break down into 4 sections and keep those notes about each chapter, so to remind myself where I am and what the structure should be, particularly towards the end. I'm writing the end of the 2nd book now. And I had to go back and really cut a lot of things out that were helpful to me as an author, like knowing background, but wouldn't really be necessary for a reader to know. It can just be intimated. So I think that structure is helpful.
You use it. You use it explicitly. You've got the 4 parts. In your book. Will you do that again, or are you going to sort of slide it under the doormat this time?
I've done it in 4 parts, but I've noticed that the 3rd part is so long. I mean, I have because it's a very plot heavy book. So, and it starts in Mexico City, and it's Mexico City and Los Angeles, and it's also the entertainment business. So there's like a lot of different moving parts. I think this one will have 4 major parts, but there will be a 5th. I think because the resolution will be leading in, hopefully, into a new story, but also I'm wrestling with just the political climate we're in and what's happening in the world. It had a very downbeat ending, and someone said to me something in a group I was talking to, how important it is to have hope. So maybe I will change that a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because obviously, Punishing Breed deals a lot with social issues. And obviously, violence is a major part of it, as you might expect in a murder mystery, but other kinds of violence as well, and other kinds of sort of bigotry and discrimination. I suppose my question is, crime fiction presupposes the idea that there will be some degree of justice. So how, dealing with all these social issues, and perhaps I don't want to be a downer, but the social mirage of justice. How did you deal with that through a crime lens?
It's very interesting you're saying that, because I think that justice, I listened to Rebecca Solnit. She came and spoke somewhere where I was working, and she said that I think the wheel of justice moves very, very slowly, but it always eventually leads to where it should. But I think in that rotation, there's a lot of injustice, and I think we're experiencing that now. I don't know if you're keeping up with United States news, but the whole thing with the United Healthcare executive being shot down in the streets of New York, and the amazing sort of reaction about the healthcare industry, and not people saying this person's a hero. The person that's the person that assassinated them. I think that's just so fascinating. And I also wonder, I think we're all questioning what is justice, right? And I'm not, and I don't think it's not right to do what he did, the person who killed the United Healthcare executive. But I think people are questioning what justice is, and particularly when you see what's happening in our political system, or you see racism, that, you think that we've gotten past a certain point in racism. Well, guess what? We haven't. And it really is cyclical, right? I mean, even Assad in Syria, I think if you had said to me 3 years ago that this would have happened, where he's leaving, I mean, in some ways, that's like a very slow rotation and wheel of justice happening. So I find justice to be something that is not always obvious, and is not the prescribed rules of society. And I am actually thinking about that in this book that I'm writing now. Like, what is really justice? And do people take it into their own hands, or do you always follow what the rules or the laws are, even if they're not necessarily, they might be the law, but are they just? So I find that a very fascinating question. And it's always also, I've been struck recently how when you read things in the paper, like if you had written a book about what happened to the United Healthcare executive and the whole sort of like journey of this person who shot him, would you even believe that? And I just read something yesterday in the New York Times about these real estate executives who were just arrested for sex trafficking.
Yeah, I read that recently.
I know. I'm just reading this going, this is so unbelievable. I believe it. Absolutely believe it. But if you wrote that, I think somebody would say, oh, well, that's just ridiculous. Because first of all, these are three men who are rich. They are successful, and they're incredibly, photogenic or whatever. I mean, what is it that puts those people, what is it, to me, that's the fascinating thing. What is it that makes those people feel that they need to do these things, or that they're compelled to do these things to other people without any sort of thought about what they're doing, or how it hurts people? I find that so interesting. And it's an unsolvable question, but we see it all the time. And I think our first reaction as human beings is not to believe it.
Can I ask you I beg your pardon, Shannon.
No, you go, Gareth.
I want to ask you a really difficult question, and I'm hoping you'll give me a one-word answer. Do you think that justice was served in A Punishing Breed?
No.
We'll keep the pause in. That was fascinating. Fair enough. We won't go any further with that.
Well, I think that leads into my next question as well, because you've talked about justice and essentially, I think, what is true and what we believe. And those are really fascinating themes. And I'm really excited to get my hands on your second book, if that's what it's going to be exploring with Detective. And it says in your bio that your background is in fundraising for an academic institution. And like your novel's murder victim, Will Bloom. Is Bloom and all the staff of Hesperia College an accurate reflection of the kinds of power and privilege dynamics found in the academic setting from your experience? And what drew you to explore these dynamics through crime fiction?
So my whole career, I've been a fundraiser. I did public television and public radio, and then worked in an education environment. And I worked for a few years for Variety, which is an entertainment newspaper, which was fascinating. What I find interesting about working in nonprofits, and particularly working in a educational setting where a lot of the students wanted to work for nonprofits, because there's this it's an idealized, I'm going to go work for this wonderful place, and these people are all going to be great, and they're all going to be doing the right things. And it's not true. People are people wherever they are. And I think there's this famous quote, and I'm going to completely mess it up, but it's I think it's the politics of academia are so terrible, but because the rewards are so small or something like that, or so petty. And it's true. Wherever you are still in that same power dynamic. And you can have a great boss who works for a bank, or you can have a great boss who works for a nonprofit, and you can have a terrible boss who works for a financial institution and a terrible boss that works for a nonprofit. I don't really think that matters. And I would also say, too, to your question, I've been so fascinated, having worked in public television and for PBS and for local stations and for academia. Where do you find most of the people at the top are white men. And if there's a question about diversity, it's usually the people in middle and lower management, or people who are just staffers. And we have, 40% people of color. Well, yeah. Are they at the top? No, not typically. And it's the same thing I find in education. I think when I started working in education, there was about there was a worry, because I think it was 49% men and 51% women. Well, now it's something like almost 60% women and 40% men in graduating from college. But who are still the CEOs? Who are still the boards, chairs of the board of all these institutions, boards and things like that? It's white men. And to find a woman who has risen to those positions, it's rare still. And why? Why is that? So I think you should follow your passion wherever it leads you. I don't know that nonprofits are not made up of saints. Educational institutions are not made up of saints. People go into professions, I think, because they have an idea that this is going to be something that they're passionate about, hopefully, or, lots of reasons, but that doesn't make it a particularly just or a better experience than any place else. I really feel that you have to have a structure, and you also have to have someone who has compassion for the people that they work with. And if you don't have that, then you're going to be in a really terrible situation wherever you are. So no, I think the book does reflect what it's like to be in an educational institution or a nonprofit. And I'm fascinated by educational institutions because you have these students who are there for 4 years, trying to make their mark on the world and trying to getting all this influx of knowledge and probably radical ideas they hadn't thought of before. Or maybe they're actually exploring those ideas that they've had, and that's why they went to that institution. And you have faculty who are indentured in some way. I mean, that's where they're probably going to spend their entire career. So they have a particular sense of ownership, I think, to those institutions, good and bad. And then I think you have people who come in and out and will probably, leave for the next better job. And then you have the trustees who go into that situation for all sorts of reasons. Some just to be a good citizen and because they love that institution. Some because it pads their resume. And even the idea of being a fundraiser to me is interesting because I approach it as philanthropy to me is actually something that is quite wonderful. I was a major gift fundraiser. So you're really trying to tie somebody's ability to give and to be passionate about giving to something they really, really care about. I don't like the transactional parts of it. So that's kind of what, but I think we're becoming more transactional. I think institutions are becoming more transactional. So that's not what I love.
Well, perhaps the whole world's becoming more transactional. I think you've.
So
I think you made an excellent choice going with DC Frost because obviously in the publishing industry, it's very much dominated by women writers being published, but you still find awards. Men tend to get most of the awards. One of the interesting things around that is the judges tend to be split in terms of the gender, but somehow these entrenched things just remain entrenched. I guess that's why they call it entrenched. And I wonder if you can avoid it in any setting, really.
Well, I think it's that whole idea of the male gaze, which I'd never even heard of until, I don't know, maybe like 15, 20 years ago. And it never even struck me. But when you're growing up, that's the world you see. You see it through the sort of white male perspective. At least that's how you're sort of, pushed towards that. And so I think a lot of times that's what people fall back on. It's like, well, that's, if a man does something audacious, it's audacious. If a woman does something audacious, I think a lot of times it's considered insane or crazy or, oh, she doesn't know what she's doing, or it's discounted. So I never thought of that until you said that. And I wrote, it's interesting. I was just at a bookstore and this woman came and she goes, well, I thought you'd be a man. I was like, oh, good. That's great. Because she'd read the book and she wanted to sign. And I was like, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you thought that. Because I think a lot of men write as women. I don't think a lot of women write as men. And I think that a lot of what I would say standard mysteries are women who are just like, I don't understand these books of women who are capable in other parts of their life, but they're married to this guy who's cheating on them and probably killing people in the next town over, and they have no idea. All their friends are saying something's off here, or they're being isolated by this person, and no one ever goes, wait, this person's terrible, why am I with him? Until the end of the book, and then there's 5 bodies they've stepped over. I don't really understand that, because I think most women are really like super smart, and because we're women, we have to operate on several different levels. You go out, you work, you have to deal with the politics, whatever that is. You come home, you're doing everything pretty much. Now, I'm not saying men don't help; they do. They're there, but I think that if you're living as a woman, you're living on, to me, at least 3 different plateaus in your life. And that you don't even think about it. So I always find it interesting that women in books are often the last, like, oh, I can't believe this man who, is my darling, is killing people and isolating me. I find that, I'm not saying that never happens. I'm just saying I find it interesting that seems to be the dominant heroine of a lot of these books.
Well, that very much applies to Will Bloom. He's very much the man that he is, and yet people do seem surprised. The women in his life, particularly, seem quite surprised by him in certain ways, which I thought was very interesting. And I am curious, actually, if Bloom is based on someone you know. That's another of these tough questions. But I also wanted to ask you, here's an alternative question that you can slide into if you prefer. Evidence, like I know you have rescue dogs. Is evidence based on anyone you know? You can answer either part of that question.
Or both.
I think Will Bloom is based on someone I met, but I think he's based on several people I've met. I think it's another one of those situations where I've worked for 2 men where that are kind of like him, and their behavior was so outrageous. And I would say that it was, when I was younger, and that wouldn't be tolerated now, but that's ridiculous, because just what I read in the New York Times, there's stories like this all the time happening. I think it's the power dynamic. If you give someone so much power and they're not a stable or good person, or let's say stable, the power can either be money or sex or, personal power for whatever reason. So yes, I I would say Will Bloom is based on two people I've worked with that, and as a bystander, someone who works there without power, you're kind of sitting there going, do you see what this person's doing? But, no one says anything. Everyone just kind of sits there. I mean, I have literally worked in an advertising agency in San Francisco as an assistant where the man who was the head of that division was having sex in his office with a woman while his wife was having a baby. And you're just kind of going, what? And can you imagine if that was like, a woman having sex with a man in her office while her husband was having some crisis that she wasn't even going to come out of her office? I mean, it just wouldn't be tolerated. It would not be accepted. So I think that there is an acceptance in some way that we accept those things. And I don't know why. And then, yes, evidence is based on one of my rescue dogs. Exactly right.
Just the one. The other two are not annoyed?
I haven't told. Don't tell them. I haven't told them. But she's my oldest rescue dog. She's 15. No, she's 17, I should say. And she looks just like Evidence. And she also is like a dog cat. She's very remote. She's not going to, run up or sit on your lap. She's independent.
An independent woman.
Yes.
Yeah. Giving it to the Will Blooms of the world. This is good news. I also want to ask you about Danny Mendoza. I have a theory about this character. He's he's got a very fractured self-image in terms of he very much seems to have two sides. And they're sort of arranged in terms of time as well, as sort of a before and after, as you said earlier. I was very much reminded of Jung's repressed id, this sort of shadow archetype, and that he's sort of an unintegrated man. But then we meet the character of DJ Arias, and I thought, in a strange way, he was like Danny's id made flesh. I was reminded of Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea book, where I'm ruining that for our listeners. But anyway, the Arias struck me as Danny's dark half. Is that audacious, insane, correct, or something else? How would you describe their relationship?
I think that's very perceptive because I feel like I feel like Danny in some ways reflects more of me or all of us who have like gotten to the point where you look back and you see yourself and the things that you did that you thought were all right or that you thought were, I did that, but that was okay. And then you go, oh, that wasn't okay. And, his reckoning is larger than is more brutal than most of us. Thank God. But I think it's that that looking back and saying, okay, I had this thing that I did. And it was this, in this case, I didn't get away with it. It was terrible. And I think that, DJ is very much like him. I think he is very much, he sees himself as this crusader in a sense, or he's doing the right things, but he's not. And I don't think he's come as far because he hasn't been found out in the same ways. I mean, he's had a personal issue with his marriage that it was a door closing, but it's not life change. It was life changing, but not in the same way. But I think he's not as further along as Danny is, because Danny has to reckon with it or he'll go back to where he was. And I don't think he can. So, but I think in some ways we're all like that. We do things and I think the women characters have the same situations. I think that, that Florencia has made a mistake. I think that, our protagonist, our woman protagonist, has also had something happen. Everybody makes mistakes in their lives, but it's like, what do you do then? That's the important thing. So did I answer the question?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm not even sure exactly what I was asking. But I think so. Yeah. I mean, I definitely, for me, Arias is a better character because Danny's there.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Danny arguably doesn't advance the plot that much in many ways, but he seems like an incredibly important character in terms of framing the other characters and giving them some of their color. So I thought that was really interesting, and also just the way that Arias also kind of brings Danny to life a little bit more. In much the same way that, you know, they say the setting. I mean, the people always say the setting is a character. I always despair at that, but I think that background always gives color to the foreground of the characters. And yeah, I thought I think that was my favorite part of the novel, is the way that the characters framed each other. I thought that was very artfully done, and
thank you.
A delight to read.
Well, thank you. That's very interesting. So someone told me a story that many years ago about someone who had drunk too much, and it was a woman, and she had struck someone down, a child, and went to jail for 10 years. And then afterwards, her mother had always promised her that they would move and that she would have a life, because she had made this horrible mistake. And it was, you know, obviously one of the worst things that can happen to the other person and to you. And so I thought that would be really interesting. How do you reckon with that? And I do think all of us could be in that situation. It's just that, you know, it didn't happen to us. So, and I think that when you're in that situation, you don't have a moral high ground. But I think it's very interesting to come up against someone who thinks they do have a moral high ground. And there's, I think, nothing worse that people do than people who think they have a moral high ground, because it's another source of power. And I love that book. Is it, oh God, it might be T.S. Eliot, I think, The Murder in the Cathedral or Death in the Cathedral. I hope I'm saying this right. It's about someone it's about Becket and King Henry. I don't remember which King Henry, but it's all about power. And so there's the power of being a king. There's the power of fighting against the king and being a rebel. But then there's the power of being a martyr. And they're all grabs for power. Because if you're doing it for any of those reasons of power, you're really aligned with the wrong thing. It's not doing it for what's right. It's doing it because you see yourself in one of those roles. And I always like, when I read that book, I thought that was just so extraordinary that someone could think of that. Why we do things. Do we ever really do things because we do them because they're right? Or do we do things because we see ourselves as being one of those people in sort of a power dynamic? And I think it's a very hard question. And I don't know if we ever really know. So yeah.
I think that's really insightful. And I remember hearing something similar because our ego is so powerful. If the action you're about to take right now, if no one could know about it, would you still do it?
Exactly.
And framing that question helps stop those moves or actions or things that we do, because internally there's always this ego, like, how does this reflect upon me and my identity and the dynamic in the world? It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating question. And I think that the one person that has no power in the book is the character who Danny ends up taking care of in the end. And I think when everything's stripped away, who are you really? So I think Warren Worthington is kind of like someone who has no power, and how do they become powerful is to reflect themselves into, project themselves into something that some other character, something else. But in the end, you know who you are because you have nothing to hide behind. So I think those are all really interesting questions. And I think just as human beings, we come across them every day. If you go into an office or if you go into even a situation, you're always dealing with power dynamics. And so I think it's something I'm thinking about a lot right now. So I think you've got the meta, your politics and what's going on in your world, and you all the way down to I have to go take, something over to this office and figure out how I'm going to get what I need. So I think in those lines, we're all doing it, and in love. I mean, it's the same thing. There's power dynamics in love too. So I just think that's really a fascinating thing to look at.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I mean, I agree. He doesn't. Can we say Warren? We should be able to say Warren.
Yeah.
Warren doesn't have a lot of power in a sort of an easily identifiable way. But what I found fascinating about him was the ways that he took some control where he could. Of certain situations, charming a police officer to stay a little bit longer. And yeah, just some of the smaller, I mean, there were large choices within the context of his life, but the sort of small choices he was making. And he was so unseen, I think, and so I guess that might in some way reflect back on the question, would someone make moral choices when they're unseen? And so I think, in the case of his character, that's a really fascinating facet.
Yeah. And I mean, I also like I think with his character too, I really wanted to explore how and I say we, and include myself in that, we look for a very narrow definition of what is acceptable or normal. And when you fall out of that narrow category, whether you're a child who has, some neural difference, or whether you're an adult who experiences, a stroke or an accident or whatever, you're no longer in this sort of mainstream of what's acceptable. And I think, people that discriminate against people for that, it's like the worst. It's like kicking a dog, and people do that. And I'm very fascinated by what is it? I think it's fear. I think it's fear of, the unknown or the other. And then if you are in that situation, how do you negotiate it? How do you make yourself survive? Because at that point, it might just be survival. And I like the way that he saw the world in a completely different way. He didn't see the world like that we see the world. And it was magical in a lot of ways for him, and kind of like a child. And I think all those things are fascinating. And it's kind of like only after you start looking at those things in yourself, and you're like, oh, I'm writing about this, you start to explore all these things. And you were talking about Jung. I was just listening to a Jungian psychologist talk about, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. It was on Andrew Huberman podcast. He's I think he's in his 80s now, this Jungian psychologist, but he was talking about how at some point in your life, maybe you've accomplished everything you thought you wanted, and it's empty, and it's not really what you want. And you might have to completely re-engineer your life because you did it because you wanted to be successful, but maybe that wasn't your true calling. And it's kind of the same thing, right? Like where you're in the middle of your life going, oh, that isn't what I want. I want this. And to feel whole, to feel like a person with purpose. And I find that really fascinating. And I listened to that, a year after I wrote the book, but I thought, oh, that's exactly what it is, right? It's like that whole thing of who are we? And we never stop growing. you could be, I think he was 40 and he was a very esteemed college professor. He was at the top of his career. He'd written several books. He was traveling all over the world giving lectures, and it was empty because he realized what he really wanted to do was be a Jungian psychologist to talk to people about, like how people become who they are meant to become. And I find that just fascinating. So I guess really, I think all books hopefully are about character, like who we are and what we seek. And I think we all have a purpose. And I think that hopefully as we, explore our lives, we explore those purposes. So I think it's when people are completely in different situations where they're not, they're not fulfilled. They're not where they should be, that you start to see all these things like a Will Bloom or like others, who terrify other people in their offices or while their wives are having children, or doing other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's like when you talk about plot, a point, I can't remember which writer said this, but a point about plot is if you give a synopsis of a book's plot, no one will be intrigued. And really, I'm pretty sure I have a terrible memory. It's famous on this podcast. I'm quite sure I won't be able to remember a lot of the plot of A Punishing Breed in a year's time, but the things that stick with you are the little character moments and all the stuff that, plot-driven or proponents of plot-driven writing will say you could take them out and it wouldn't matter. But it's always been my experience with life that it's the tiny little things, like, making sure you get your orange soda, that actually, gives it its richness. And I think, I think one of the very strong things about A Punishing Breed is that it has a lot of those moments in it. Small moments between characters or moments when they're sort of, experiencing something that's actually tremendously important to them, which another person might, say doesn't seem like that's the big picture stuff we need to be worrying about.
I agree.
I think that's what makes books survive. When people talk about books they like, they often reference a single line or a single scene, not the overall sweep. And likewise in life, we become very obsessed with the white noise of jobs and all those big structures, but it often boils down to just a couple of key moments, a twinkle in the eye sort of thing.
Well, also, I think you're right. And I think that, I don't know how you feel about this, but a lot of times you'll be somewhere and someone will do something or say something that's absolutely extraordinary. And people will just go right by it and not say what, to me, the whole character of Warren Worthington, the idea of him pulling the roller bag. I came back from a business trip, and it was probably 11 o'clock at night. And I was getting out of my car and I heard this like on the street, and I'm looking around and I see this man. I don't live anywhere near a bus or train or anything. I see this man walking around the middle of my street with a roller bag, and he's probably like 6'5", and he's wearing this black overcoat, and he's just like walking on the street. And I'm like, what is this guy doing at 11 o'clock at night with a roller bag in the middle of the street? And that's extraordinary to me. And I was just, my mom recently passed away, and her cousin came, who was in her 90s, and said, "Oh, I love Joanne. We had such a great, we had a great life together. We grew up together." And, I stabbed her with a fork. And I was like, what? I'm still trying to figure out, what do you mean you stabbed her with a fork? What? It's so funny. It's not exactly what you're saying, but I think there are those moments in our life. I mean, when you look back on someone you love, I don't think you'll remember the whole sweep and scope of their life. I think you'll remember that, I remember, I'm going to cry. I remember when I met my husband after we'd been dating for a while. We were in Long Beach and we were reading books on a bench, and it was so peaceful. And he started rubbing the top of my head. And I just thought, oh, this is peace and this is love and this is life. That's what I'll remember. I won't remember his career. I'll remember his career, but those aren't the things that are important to me. The things that are important to us are the things that happen in those moments between, right? And that we pay attention. And when someone does something extraordinary or something strange happens to me, it's like, well, let's find out why that happened. Like, what happened there? Why did that happen? Why is that person like walking down the middle of the street at 11 o'clock at night? And why did my mom's cousin stab her with a fork when they were kids?
Yeah,
I have a similar story. My sister stabbed me with a butter knife in my foot when I was younger. You know, just those classic little romps where you're just fighting and you're pulling pieces out and whatever missile you can find, it's in use. I'm going to segue here for a little bit because you kind of mentioned this off camera and I want you to get it on so our audience can hear. As a debut author, what has the publishing journey been like for you, and do you have any advice for aspiring writers?
Yes. So my husband convinced me to go to this writing workshop, and it was in New Mexico, Abiquiu, which is where Georgia O'Keeffe lived. And it's it's north of Santa Fe. So it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and it's beautiful and stunning. So I went, and it was very lonely. It was only lonely because I didn't know anybody, but the writers were amazing and lovely. And the woman that was running it, Kate Gale, who is the publisher and founder of Red Hen Press, was there. And it was a small group. And I didn't feel like we got particularly along that well or anything. I mean, it was nice. She was fine. She had a lot of things going on. But what happened was, because I was a fundraiser and she had a nonprofit, she started like keeping in touch with me. And I was like, oh, okay. And then I thought, well, if I could be helpful, this will be great. I'd like to be helpful. And then as we got to know each other more, she said, well, I have a writing group. And the first class I took from her was about publishing. And it was fascinating and eye-opening because everything in this world moves so quickly because of technology, except for publishing and writers. And even if you send your stories to literary journals, you could not hear back in 8 months or a year. And then you hear back and it's like, nope, not interested. Or you hear back and like, okay, yes, we'd love to publish this. And you're like, what did I say?
Yeah, I've moved on.
Which one is that? And it's so frustrating as a writer, but it was so interesting to hear about it from the other side. And her point was, get to know everybody that you can. Go to writing panels. Go up to people. Introduce yourself. If you truly like what they're doing, tell them. Or ask questions and be curious. Make an impression. And that doesn't mean like, hey, something, but like, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing. And always get to know the person's first name, because if you're looking at 1,000 manuscripts, a month or a week, whatever, what is going to make you stand out? And if you can say, hey, I met you at Abiquiu in New Mexico, and Kate, I hope, you take the time to read this book. It's going to at least make her pause and go, oh, okay, I'll look at this. That was one thing. And then the next thing was just, I entered her writing group, because I find writing groups to be really helpful, because if you have a good writing group and people are, you're all sharing your work and they have your best interests at heart, there's nothing better than someone saying that doesn't work. And I always immediately, I'm like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. And then I go back and go, well, I guess they do know what they're talking about. That doesn't work. I understand what they're saying. Or go deeper. Some of the things, a lot of things that Kate would say is go deeper. And there's a scene that's an assault, and she made me think about that and go deeper. And I think that hearing those things are really important. What I tell everybody, and so my son's a filmmaker, and he entered his short film into competitions, and he got into this competition he didn't think was worthwhile. And I said, go, you don't know what's going to happen. because that's just it. Would I ever have thought I was going to go to this writing retreat and, 4 years later, my book was going to be published because of that? No, it just didn't even enter my mind. And I think it's just meeting people and being the best version of yourself you can be, and being generous to other writers and to other people. And then the people that come and want to hear about your book, or I feel very, very beholden to bookstores. Like if there's a lot of people that come, I'm so happy. And if there's 3, I feel like, oh my God, these poor people, like all this stuff, and they have all these chairs. And that was helpful because I often read with other people. And I think, just seeing the grace with other writers, it doesn't matter because those 3 people have made they've come, they expect, they've made that effort, and you need to show up for them and be the best person you can be, and be the best version of yourself that you can be. So I think those are all really important, and you just never know. You never know, first of all, the insight they can give you. I mean, you both have given me great insight into what you found in the book. And I find that to be fascinating, what other people see in your book and what you see in other people's books, because I think you're peeling away layers, and all those things are important. And it doesn't really matter if it's an insight or if it's moving your book forward in some way. It's that's what human interaction is. And if you don't show up, you're never going to get it. Right. So I think that, being available, being open, and really trying not to be a know-it-all, because I think that the more that you write, the more you realize you just don't really know very much at all. You're really exploring everything. And even when you're writing, you don't know it. It's, I find it fascinating that after something's done and gone into the world, someone can say something to you and you can say, oh, they're absolutely right. That was the whole purpose. That was the thing that's the constant in each character. I didn't even know that when I was writing it, that each character goes through a breaking point that they have to live through and push on through until after it was done. And so in some ways, it's also going back to that idea of Stephen King and on writing, that idea that you're on a tightrope and you don't even know what you've put together until it's done. And even after it's done, it's still evolving. So I find that very interesting. It's the opposite of control, because the one other thing I think as I grow older, we don't have any control. It's all an illusion, right? You think you have control. And there's things that have happened in my life where I've discovered things through DNA stuff. Things where people thought they had control, and guess what? You don't have any control. And the more you think you have control, the less you probably have.
I am very intrigued on this DNA thing. You can go there if you want to.
I can't. Okay. Talk to me in a year. Talk to me in a year, and maybe it'll all be worked out. But it is true, right? People think they control other people, or that they control their situation, or they control, their little world. And I don't think we really do. We don't.
No, it actually, if you want to pitch if you decide to write an autobiography, a life in writing or something, living like a first draft, because, we talked earlier about the idea that you've got to write something to have something to work with. And in terms of networking, you've got to show up without necessarily knowing where that's going to lead. But I mean, all these things are very much moments where you don't really have control. You only have the sort of control to participate.
Exactly.
And that's about as far as it gets. It's always interesting when people read your work and surprise you with their readings. And I always think too that writers that can't surprise themselves are probably not going to surprise their readers.
That's probably true.
Yeah. So I guess completely veering away from that and going in the absolute opposite direction. Do you want to give us any scoops on your second book? working titles, who did it, anything like that for the pleasure of the text.
The second one is called A Shadow of Jaguars, and it starts in Mexico City, and it starts with something that happened to my husband. I'm half Mexican, and my husband's half Mexican, half German, and his family in Mexico City. We go down there, try to go down every other year because he has a big cousins reunion. But one year he went down early in our marriage, I think, because someone in his family had passed away, and it had been like a great aunt or something. And so his family went into, they have a vigil where they went into the cathedral and they stayed the night and they bring presents for her and stuff. Well, they got robbed. Someone came in, a group of people came in and robbed them. And he came back, and his family is very lovely. And they are also very interesting because I'm from a family that talks about everything, like blah, blah, blah. So I said, oh my God, like, this is crazy. They got robbed. He said, yeah, they don't want to talk about it. I said, what? So they don't really want to talk about it. I go, well, what did you think? And he's a reporter. He never wants to talk about anything. He never wants to talk about, like, let's get into this. And this is why people do it. He never wants to talk about anything. And I'm like, what? And no one's ever mentioned it to me. And I've just been fascinated by it. So it starts there. And it also takes part. So that's kind of where it starts. And then I have this other dynamic. Like, I had a cousin that was kind of like my brother, but there was all this kind of family stuff. And so I have like this kind of cousin thing going on too. And then they come back to LA and there's like a whole sort of, it's connected to a director. Something happens in his house, and that's kind of where the Hollywood part comes in. And I do sort of reference my time working at Variety because I thought it was I think I worked there 2.5 years, and it's the only for-profit that I really worked at as an adult, like where I had this as a, not as an assistant, but where I had a real job. And so I found it just to be so fast moving and so crazy, but also still at the fringes of the entertainment business, right? You're writing about it. And how that really, I thought the writers would all be like so excited, so happy. And I couldn't wait because I was a writer. And they were like miserable, like, you have to write about these assholes that drive like, these cars, and they all went to East Coast schools and they're all being paid like 30 times. I mean, it was so fascinating to me. So that's kind of where, and the Shadow of Jaguars is actually, Jaguars, like a group of jaguars, is called a shadow. I was going to name it He Who Kills with One Blow, which is what the Nahuatl word, or it's the indigenous sort of word for jaguar. That's what it means. He Who Kills with One Blow, because they were so prevalent, jaguars, and they're kind of like a mystical animal, and they're the fiercest warriors, and they see at night, and they move between the sun and the moon. So they're very, very mythical and beautiful, kind of what it means.
And do we have a date?
I think it's coming out in 2026, so I have to get it done by February. So we'll see.
Well, you'll have to come back and talk to us about it.
Well, I'd love to. I would love to. And this has been so insightful. Thank you. I mean, you've said such really interesting things, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today, Denise, and jumping on. Where can we send our audience to go purchase a copy of your book, A Punishing Breed?
So it's available wherever you find books. So it's at Amazon, obviously, but it's at bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, any of those places that you'd like to support. It should be there. And if you'd like to reach out to me, I'm at denisefrost.net, and would love to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much, and looking forward to that second book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So there we have it, DC Frost. And, you guys, I got a lot of that out of that interview, and I bet everyone else did as well. And as she mentioned, you can pick up a copy of that book at a place that you can get a good book or anywhere. It's on Amazon. You can get an online copy or a physical copy. And just a heads up, we have finished reading Cruddy, and that is our next episode. We're going to be reviewing Cruddy by Linda Barry.
I should also say, that was beautifully done, and obviously now would be the time for me to shut up. But I just want to say, A Punishing Breed is published by Red Hen Press, and will also soon be available from Audible Books if you enjoy listening to good writing.
Yes, the Audible book has had some amazing reviews. So if you're not much into, or if you've got any long car trips planned over this Christmas period, definitely pick up a copy of that Audible book.
All right, Shannon. Well, that's it for us, I would say. I'll see you in the next episode of The Pleasure of the Text.
And if we don't see you until then, have a very Merry Christmas, everyone, and Happy New Year.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.